Okay, we are now at the part of the story where the trial is taking place. In chapter 16, Jem, Scout, and Dill entered the courthouse and they were looking for a spot, and they end up sitting on the balcony with Reverend Sykes and the rest of the black members of Maycomb. Now we're watching the trial begin, and you can meet me on page 189. Jem, I said, are those the Yules sitting down yonder? Hush, said Jem. Mr. Heck Tate is testifying. Mr. Tate dressed for the occasion. He wore an ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his high boots, lumberjacket, and bullet-studded belt. From that moment, he ceased to terrify me. He was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. The solicitor, Mr. Gilmer, was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville. We saw him only when court convened, and that rarely, for court was no interest to Jem and me. A balding, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Although his back was to us, we knew he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which he used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person when he was actually doing nothing of the kind. Thus, he was hell on juries and witnesses. The jury, thinking themselves under close scrutiny, paid attention. So did the witnesses. Page 190. In your own words, Mr. Tate, Mr. Gilmer was saying. Well, said Mr. Tate, touching his glasses and speaking to his knees, I was called. Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you. Who called you? Mr. Tate said, I was fetched by Bob, Mr. Bob Yule, yonder, one night. What night, sir? Mr. Tate said, it was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Yule came in, very excited he was, and said, Get out to his house quick. Some Negro raped his girl. Did you go? Certainly. I got in the car and went out as fast as I could. What did you find? I found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner and said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson. Judge Taylor, who had been concentrating on his fingernails, looked up as if he was expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. I asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Tom Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there was to it. Thank you, said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, any questions, Atticus? Yes, said my father. He was sitting behind his table. His chair was skewed to one side. His legs were crossed and one arm was resting on the back of his chair. Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anyone call a doctor? Asked Atticus. No, sir, said Mr. Tate. Didn't call a doctor? No, sir, repeated Mr. Tate. Why not? Sorry. Why not? There was an edge to Atticus's voice. Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something for sure happened. It was obvious. But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one? No, sir. Judge Taylor broke in. He answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. Atticus said, I just want to make sure, Judge. And the judge smiled. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in breath suddenly. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was trying to be dramatic. Dill was watching peacefully, and so was Reverend Sykes behind him. What is it? I whispered, and got a terse shh. Sheriff, Atticus was saying, you say she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, just describe her injuries, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruises coming out on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. How did you know? Mr. Tate grinned. Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there. She had a black eye coming. Which eye? Mr. Tate blinked and ran his hand through his hair. Let's see, he said softly. Then he looked at Atticus, as if considering the question childish. Can't you remember? Atticus asked. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, Her left. 192. Wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you or her left looking the same way you were? Mr. Tate said, Oh, yes, that would make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was banged up on the side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. Then he turned his head and looked at Tom Robinson. As if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Atticus walked to the court reporter's desk, bent down to the furiously scribbling hand. It stopped, flipped back to the shorthand pad, and the court reporter said, Mr. Finch, I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. Which side again, heck? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Atticus seemed to be bordering on another question. He thought better of it and said, Yes, what were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson, as if to say this was something they hadn't bargained for. Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All about her throat, at the back of her neck. I'd say all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around with it. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly. Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand.